My name is Kate. I'm 22 years old, and 2 weeks ago, I collapsed on a stage in front of 3,000 people. It was supposed to be the best day of my life. Graduation. The valedictorian speech. The moment everyone said made the years of work worth it. I remember standing at the podium, lights bright above me, my name already announced. I wasn't nervous. I was steady. That mattered later. I had just opened my mouth to speak when my vision shifted. Not blurred, fractured. The room felt tilted, like gravity had changed its mind. I grabbed the podium because my body knew something was wrong before I did. Then everything went dark. I didn't hear the crowd gasp. I didn't hear my name being shouted. I only know because people told me later. They said 2 professors caught me before I hit the floor. They said my notes slid across the stage. They said it happened fast. I woke up briefly in an ambulance. Bright lights. A paramedic telling me to stay awake. Then darkness again. At the hospital they ran scans. MRI. Doctors stopped using casual voices. One of them finally sat down next to my bed and said the sentence that split my life in half. "You have a brain tumor," he said. "We need to operate immediately." There was no dramatic reaction. No screaming. No tears. Just a strange stillness, like my body had already decided panic wouldn't help. I asked one question. "Can you call my parents?" The nurse nodded and stepped out with my phone. I stared at the ceiling while machines beeped steadily beside me. Minutes passed. Then more. No one came back with good news. They called my mother first. Straight to voicemail. Then my father. Rings. Voicemail. Again. And again. By the time the surgeon returned, my phone showed missed calls, all outgoing. My parents' names stacked on the screen unanswered. The doctor explained risks. Percentages. Recovery windows. Then he asked who would sign consent if I lost consciousness. I said my grandfather's name. That surprised him. I noticed. They prepped me for surgery that night. The anesthesiologist told me to count backward from 10. I made it to 7. When I finally woke up 3 days later, I was surrounded by beeping machines. For tubes taped to my arm. My head wrapped so tightly it felt heavier than my body. My throat was dry. My limbs barely responded. The first thing I did was reach for my phone. Not to scroll. Not to text. Just to see if my parents had come. They hadn't. What I saw instead was an Instagram post. My sister. My parents. The whole family. All of them smiling in front of the Eiffel Tower. The caption read, "Family trip in Paris. Finally no stress. No drama." I didn't comment. I didn't cry. I didn't even lock my phone. I just stared at the screen and let it sink in. 65 missed calls appeared later that day, all from my dad. Then one text. "We need you. Answer immediately." That's when I understood something clearly for the first time. They weren't calling because they missed me. They were calling because they needed something else entirely. Before I continue, if this story feels worth hearing, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want to know how this ends. And if you're watching right now, drop a comment telling me where you're from and what time it is there. Because to understand why seeing that post hurt more than the surgery, you need to go back 4 weeks earlier, to the day everything quietly started falling apart. For weeks before graduation, I was standing in my childhood kitchen, and I didn't know yet that my place in this family had already been decided. To understand why that photo shattered me, you need to see how my family treated me long before I collapsed. When I woke up after surgery, the doctors told me I'd been unconscious for just over 72 hours. 3 full days. Long enough for my body to be cut open. Long enough for my skull to be opened and closed again. Long enough for decisions to be made without me. And long enough, apparently, for my family to board a plane and leave the country. The room was quiet except for the steady beeping beside my bed. The nurse noticed I was awake and smiled gently. The kind of smile people use when they're trying not to scare you. "Your surgery went well," she said. "You're very lucky." I nodded. My head hurt too much to respond. My mouth felt like sandpaper. My arm barely lifted when I reached for my phone on the tray beside me. I wasn't thinking about Paris. I was thinking about whether my parents had finally shown up. They hadn't. No flowers. No jacket draped over a chair. No familiar voices arguing softly in the hallway. Just me alone and a screen lighting up my face. That's when I saw the post. It was from my sister, Meredith, posted less than an hour earlier. The photo was perfect. Professionally perfect. Everyone was framed just right. My parents in the center, Meredith leaning into my mom, my dad's arm wrapped around both of them. The Eiffel Tower rose behind them like it had been placed there on purpose. They looked relaxed, happy, untouched by anything happening back home. The caption said, "Family trip in Paris. Finally, no stress. No drama." I read it twice. Then a third time. No stress. No drama. I was lying in a hospital bed with staples in my head, and that was the caption they chose. I didn't comment. I didn't type anything angry and delete it. I didn't even lock my phone right away. I just set it down and stared at the ceiling until the beeping blurred into background noise. An hour later, my phone buzzed again. And again. And again. Missed calls. All from my dad. 10, 20, 40. By the time I checked again, there were 65 missed calls stacked on my screen. Then one text message appeared underneath them. "We need you. Answer immediately." Not "Are you okay?" Not "We're coming home." Not even "We're sorry." Just "We need you." That's when something inside me finally clicked into place. They didn't disappear because they were afraid. They didn't miss the surgery because they didn't know. They left because for them I was inconvenient. Whatever they needed from me, money, permission, something legal, something quiet, they couldn't do it without my voice. And now that I was awake, they needed me to cooperate. I didn't answer. Instead, I scrolled. More photos appeared as I refreshed the feed. Cafe tables. Shopping bags. My mother smiling with a croissant in her hand. My father holding a glass of wine like he had nothing waiting for him on the other side of the world. I thought about the nurse who had held my hand when they wheeled me into surgery. I thought about my grandfather signing consent forms because no one else would. I thought about the empty chairs beside my bed. And for the first time, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. Because this wasn't a one-time failure. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was who they'd always been. And if this story sounds familiar so far, stay with me because the reason that Paris post hurt so deeply has nothing to do with that trip. It has everything to do with how my family treated me long before I ever collapsed on that stage. To understand why this felt inevitable, you need to see how I became invisible in my own family. Growing up, our house looked perfect from the outside. 2 stories. White siding. A swing set in the backyard that my father assembled himself one summer and never touched again. From the street, we looked like the kind of family people trusted. Inside, there was a system. I didn't have words for it at first. I just knew that my sister Meredith was always at the center of things, and I was somewhere nearby, useful, quiet, replaceable. She was older by 3 years. Loud. Confident. The kind of kid teachers remembered and neighbors asked about. When she walked into a room, people noticed. When I did, people expected things. I was 8 the first time I heard the phrase. My parents were in the kitchen talking about schedules. Meredith had a recital that night. I had a science project due the next morning. I remember holding my backpack, waiting to ask for help. My dad didn't look at me when he said it. "She's adopted in spirit," he told my mother, like it explained everything. "She doesn't need as much attention." I didn't know what adopted in spirit meant. I just knew it landed differently than the word daughter. After that, it became normal. Meredith forgot her lunch and my mom drove it to school. I forgot mine, and the secretary handed me a peanut butter sandwich with my name written wrong on a sticky note. Meredith cried about a bad grade, and my parents stayed up late helping her rewrite an essay. I brought home straight A's and my dad nodded once, already scrolling on his phone. When chores needed to be done, I was reliable. When something broke, I fixed it or learned how. When money was tight, I worked. No one asked me how I was doing. They asked what I could handle. By the time I was in high school, I understood the rules. Don't complain. Don't need too much. Don't expect praise. I worked after school. Weekends too. I saved for college application fees myself. I kept a 4.0 GPA because it was the one thing no one could take from me. Meredith didn't work. She didn't need to. She had plans. She had support. She had parents who talked about her future like it mattered to them. Mine was something I was supposed to figure out quietly. If I ever brought it up, my mother would smile in that tight way and say, "You're just more independent, Grace." That's a good thing. And I believed her. Because believing her hurt less than believing the alternative. That I wasn't difficult. That I wasn't asking for too much. That I simply wasn't chosen. The worst part wasn't the neglect. It was how normal it felt. By the time graduation approached, I told myself not to expect anything special. I told myself ceremonies were symbolic, not important. I told myself I didn't need anyone in the audience to feel proud. But some part of me still hoped. Just a little. Because graduation was supposed to be the one day that proved I existed. I didn't realize it then, but even that moment was already being taken from me. Growing up, our house looked perfect from the outside. 2 stories. White siding. A swing set in the backyard that my father assembled himself one summer and never touched again. From the street, we looked like the kind of family people trusted. Inside, there was a system. I didn't have words for it at first. I just knew that my sister Meredith was always at the center of things, and I was somewhere nearby, useful, quiet, replaceable. She was older by 3 years. Loud. Confident. The kind of kid teachers remembered and neighbors asked about. When she walked into a room, people noticed. When I did, people expected things. I was 8 the first time I heard the phrase. My parents were in the kitchen talking about schedules. Meredith had a recital that night. I had a science project due the next morning. I remember holding my backpack, waiting to ask for help. My dad didn't look at me when he said it. She's adopted in spirit, he told my mother, like it explained everything. She doesn't need as much attention. I didn't know what adopted in spirit meant. I just knew it landed differently than the word daughter. After that, it became normal. Meredith forgot her lunch and my mom drove it to school. I forgot mine, and the secretary handed me a peanut butter sandwich with my name written wrong on a sticky note. Meredith cried about a bad grade, and my parents stayed up late helping her rewrite an essay. I brought home straight A's and my dad nodded once, already scrolling on his phone. When chores needed to be done, I was reliable. When something broke, I fixed it or learned how. When money was tight, I worked. No one asked me how I was doing. They asked what I could handle. By the time I was in high school, I understood the rules. Don't complain. Don't need too much. Don't expect praise. I worked after school. Weekends too. I saved for college application fees myself. I kept a 4.0 GPA because it was the one thing no one could take from me. Meredith didn't work. She didn't need to. She had plans. She had support. She had parents who talked about her future like it mattered to them. Mine was something I was supposed to figure out quietly. If I ever brought it up, my mother would smile in that tight way and say, "You're just more independent, Grace." That's a good thing. And I believed her. Because believing her hurt less than believing the alternative. That I wasn't difficult. That I wasn't asking for too much. That I simply wasn't chosen. The worst part wasn't the neglect. It was how normal it felt. By the time graduation approached, I told myself not to expect anything special. I told myself ceremonies were symbolic, not important. I told myself I didn't need anyone in the audience to feel proud. But some part of me still hoped. Just a little. Because graduation was supposed to be the one day that proved I existed. I didn't realize it then, but even that moment was already being taken from me. The headaches started quietly. At first, they felt like pressure, something dull and constant sitting just behind my eyes. I told myself it was stress. Graduation week. Long nights. Too much caffeine. That explanation was convenient, so I kept it. Then came the nosebleeds. Not dramatic. Just sudden. I'd be washing dishes or folding laundry, and warm drops would hit my hand. I learned how to tilt my head back and wait it out without making a scene. I didn't tell my parents. I already knew what they'd say. "You're run down. You need more sleep. Everyone gets headaches." So I kept moving. I was still working part-time. Still helping with party prep. Still running errands when my mom asked. My calendar was full, and somehow my name wasn't on it. One afternoon I stood up too fast in the kitchen, and the room tilted sharply to the left. I grabbed the counter and waited for the world to settle. My mother glanced over. "Careful," she said. "We don't need anyone fainting before the party." She meant it as a joke. I smiled so she wouldn't worry. The dizziness got worse as the days passed. Sometimes my vision blurred for a second or two, like someone had smeared water across a lens. I learned to blink it away. There was no space for weakness. The night before the engagement party, I was wrapping silverware in napkins when my hands started shaking. I pressed them flat against the table until they stopped. That was when Rachel noticed. Rachel had been my best friend since freshman year. She showed up to help, took one look at me and frowned. "You don't look okay," she said quietly. "I'm fine," I answered automatically. She didn't buy it. "You've been saying that for weeks," she said. "You're pale. You're losing weight. And your nose just bled." I shrugged. "It's just stress." Rachel lowered her voice. "Grace, stress doesn't do this." Before I could respond, my mom called from the other room, asking for help with decorations. The moment passed. Rachel squeezed my arm before I walked away. "Please promise me you'll see a doctor after graduation." "I will," I said. I meant it. I just didn't know if I'd make it that far. That night, after everyone went to bed, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My head throbbed in time with my heartbeat. Every pulse felt heavier than the last. I counted breaths. I counted seconds. I told myself I was being dramatic. Around 3 a.m., I sat up too quickly and had to grab the edge of the bed to keep from falling over. My stomach rolled. My ears rang. Still, I didn't wake anyone. There was a part of me that believed if I caused trouble, if I made things inconvenient, it would only confirm what I'd always been told. That I was too much. That I was a distraction. That other things mattered more. So I waited for morning. I showered. I dressed. I helped finish setting up for the party like nothing was wrong. By then the pain wasn't subtle anymore. It was sharp, focused, persistent. But graduation was tomorrow. The party was tonight. Everyone was counting on me to hold it together. And I did. Right up until my body decided it couldn't wait any longer. The night before graduation, my body finally said enough. And it did it in front of everyone. The engagement party was held at my parents' house that evening. It didn't look like my parents' house anymore. There were white tents in the backyard, string lights woven through the trees, a rented bar set up near the patio, a catering truck idled by the driveway. Someone had even hired a photographer. It was extravagant, intentional, loud. I arrived early like I always did, and was immediately handed a list of things to do. No greeting. No "how are you feeling?" Just instructions. Meredith arrived an hour later. She stepped out of her car smiling, already glowing, already surrounded by attention. People hugged her, complimented her ring, asked about the wedding plans. She barely looked at me. When she did, her eyes flicked over my dress. "That's what you're wearing?" she asked, not quietly. I nodded. She smiled thinly. "Brave choice." A few people laughed. I pretended not to hear it and kept arranging chairs. During dinner, my father stood up to make a toast. He talked about Meredith's future, her ambition, her luck, how proud he was to call her his daughter. Then he raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said. No one mentioned my graduation. Not once. Later, when dessert was being served, Meredith clinked her glass for attention. "I just want to thank everyone for coming," she said. "Especially my parents who have always believed in me. And Grace," she added, glancing my way, "for helping out. She's always been reliable." The pause mattered. Reliable. Not accomplished. Not graduating with honors. Just useful. Laughter rippled through the crowd. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. That mix of heat and pressure I'd learned to swallow without reacting. That's when Meredith leaned closer and lowered her voice, low enough that it sounded private, but loud enough that people nearby could hear. "You know," she said, smiling, "it's probably good you didn't get much attention tonight. You wouldn't know what to do with it anyway." Someone snorted. I stared at the tablecloth and counted to 3. Across the table, a man I didn't recognize was watching me. He looked to be in his 70s, neatly dressed, posture straight. When our eyes met, his expression didn't hold amusement. It held concern. Later, as I was clearing plates, he approached me quietly. "You're Grace," he said. "Yes." He nodded once. "I'm Mr. Patterson. I knew your grandfather." I paused. "He would have wanted to be here tonight," he continued. "And he would not have liked what he just saw." I didn't know what to say. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Your grandfather should know. I looked up, but Mr. Patterson was already walking away, blending back into the crowd. The party went on like nothing had happened. Music played. People laughed. My sister posed for photos. I stood near the edge of it all, holding a tray of empty glasses, feeling strangely distant, like I was watching someone else's life through a screen. Then my mother tapped her spoon against her glass. I have one more announcement, she said, smiling brightly. The crowd quieted. I didn't know yet that what she was about to say would change everything I thought I understood about my family. The next thing my mother said explained why no one planned to be at my graduation, and why they never intended to be. 2 days after the engagement party, my parents called a family meeting. That alone felt strange. We didn't really do meetings. Decisions were usually announced, not discussed. Still, I showed up. I always did. We sat around the dining table, the same one where my sister's engagement photos were still spread out. Printed. Glossy. Smiling faces everywhere. My mother cleared her throat. We're going to Paris, she said. I blinked once just to make sure I heard her correctly. Paris. I repeated. My father nodded, already looking at his phone. We've been meaning to take this trip for years. The timing finally worked out. I glanced at the calendar on the wall. The date was circled in red. Graduation week. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse them. I just asked one question. That's the same week as my graduation. My mother smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Yes, we know. My father finally looked up. You don't really need us there, Grace. You're independent. You've always figured things out. The words landed softly, but they cut deep. My sister didn't say anything. She just kept scrolling through her phone, occasionally tilting it toward my mother to show her hotel photos. I waited. For a pause. For a correction. For someone to say, we'll adjust. We'll make it work. Instead, my mother said, this is a big moment for your sister. We've all been under so much stress. I nodded slowly. So you won't be there, I said. My father shrugged. You'll walk across the stage whether we're sitting there or not. That was it. No argument. No justification. Just a conclusion they'd already accepted. I stood up calmly and pushed my chair in. No one stopped me. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. I didn't cry. Not yet. I felt something worse. Empty. That night, the headaches came back harder than before. A deep pressure behind my eyes. I pressed my fingers to my temples and waited for it to pass. It didn't. The next morning, I woke up dizzy. The room tilted when I stood. My nose started bleeding while I brushed my teeth, slow at first, then fast. I cleaned it up and didn't tell anyone. At breakfast, my mother handed me a list. Can you help with a few things before we leave? She asked. Laundry, packing, grocery run. I looked at the list. Then at her. You're leaving for Paris, I said quietly. During my graduation week. Yes, she said, impatient now. And? I nodded again. Okay. That was the moment something inside me shut down. Not anger. Not sadness. Just acceptance. Over the next 3 days, they talked about Paris constantly. Museums. Cafes. Photos they'd take. Dresses my sister wanted to pack. No one asked how I was feeling. No one noticed I stopped eating. No one commented when I winced at sudden noises or leaned against walls to steady myself. My best friend Rachel did. She stopped by the house one evening and found me sitting on the floor of my room. Textbooks spread out, lights dim. Grace, she said carefully, you don't look okay. I'm fine, I replied automatically. She didn't argue. She just sat next to me. You've been getting nosebleeds, she said. And you're shaking. I'm just tired. She hesitated. Have you seen a doctor? I shook my head. After graduation, I said. I just need to get through that. Rachel looked like she wanted to say more, but she didn't push. She squeezed my hand once before leaving. The night before graduation, my parents were packing. Suitcases lined the hallway. I stood in the doorway and watched them. We'll be boarding by the time you walk, my mother said casually. Send us pictures. My father added. And don't make this into a thing. I nodded. I won't. I meant it. because the next day when I walked onto that stage, everything changed. And none of them were there to see it. 3 days later, I stepped up to the podium, and halfway through my speech, my vision went black. Graduation day arrived quietly. No texts, no calls, no last-minute excuses. I woke up early, ironed my gown, and pinned my hair back the way my mother used to when I was younger. The house was silent. I checked my phone anyway. Still nothing. By then I wasn't surprised. I told myself I didn't need anyone else to walk across that stage. The auditorium was already full when I arrived. 3,000 people, give or take. Parents holding flowers. Families crowding the aisles. Cameras lifted, voices overlapping, excitement buzzing in the air. I stepped onto the stage with the rest of the graduates and scanned the audience once, just once. The seats reserved for my family were empty. No mother leaning forward. No father waving. No sister whispering to anyone nearby. Only my grandfather sat there alone, hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes locked on me like I was the only person he came to see. I swallowed and looked away. Names were called one by one. Applause rose and fell in waves. When my name was announced, the clapping was loud, polite, generous. I stood, walked across the stage, and accepted my diploma. I smiled because that's what you do. I nodded because that's what you're supposed to do. Then it was time for the speech. I stepped up to the podium and adjusted the microphone. The lights were brighter than I expected, warm and unforgiving. My notes rested neatly on the stand, printed in a font I'd chosen carefully so I wouldn't lose my place. I took a breath. Good afternoon. I began, my voice steady. Class of. The room seemed to tilt slightly, just enough to notice. I kept going. I thanked the professors. I thanked the staff. I thanked the friends who stayed up late studying, who believed we'd all make it through. The words came out smoothly, exactly as I'd practiced them. But something felt wrong. My vision blurred at the edges. The lights stretched longer than they should have. I blinked once, then twice, and felt a pressure bloom behind my eyes. Deep, sharp, unfamiliar. I shifted my weight and kept talking. That's when the dizziness hit. The room narrowed into a tunnel. Faces melted into shapes. The words on the page stopped making sense. I remember thinking, just finish the sentence. Just get through the next line. I tried to smile. I never reached the end of the paragraph. The next thing I knew, the floor was rushing toward me. Someone shouted my name. Chairs scraped. A microphone screeched as it hit the ground. Then everything went dark. I don't remember the ambulance. I don't remember the oxygen mask or the paramedic asking me questions. I don't remember being lifted or carried or rushed through hallways. All of that was told to me later. What I know is this. While 3,000 people watched me collapse, my parents were boarding a plane. While doctors ran scans and whispered to each other, my phone kept ringing unanswered. While my grandfather signed papers with shaking hands, my family was already gone. And when I finally woke up, I learned just how deliberate that choice had been. I came back in pieces. Not all at once. Not cleanly. Just fragments. A ceiling that wasn't familiar. A soft mechanical beeping that didn't stop. A weight in my head that felt heavy, but distant, like it belonged to someone else. My mouth was dry. My arms felt slow, uncooperative. I tried to move. Someone noticed. Grace, a voice said gently. Can you hear me? I blinked. That seemed to be enough. A nurse leaned into my line of sight, her voice calm, practiced. She told me I was in the hospital. She told me I'd fainted during my graduation speech. She told me I was safe. Then she paused. We found something on the scan, she said. That was the moment the room changed. A doctor came in next. Then another. They stood close together, speaking carefully the way people do when every word matters. One of them pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down so we were eye level. You have a tumor, he said. In your brain. He waited for the words to land. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just stared at him and nodded like he'd told me the weather. He explained that it wasn't something they could wait on. The pressure was already causing symptoms, headaches, dizziness, nosebleeds. Everything suddenly made sense in a way I didn't want it to. We need to operate, he said. Soon. Possibly tonight. I asked one question. It was the only one that came to mind. Can you call my parents? He nodded. We already have. They tried again while I lay there. And again. And again. Voicemail. No answer. Straight to voicemail. A nurse showed me the call log later. I counted without meaning to. 12 attempts. Then 20. Then more. Different numbers. Same result. My grandfather arrived sometime after that. I remember his coat before I remember his face. I remember how carefully he held my hand, like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. He told me they still hadn't answered. By then I understood the risk. The doctors explained it clearly. Without surgery, the swelling could worsen. Waiting wasn't safe. Consent had to be signed. My grandfather didn't hesitate. He read every page. He asked questions. He signed where they told him to sign. His handwriting steady even though his hands weren't. The surgery was scheduled. Hours passed. Or minutes. Time didn't feel real anymore. I drifted in and out, listening to the quiet urgency of nurses moving around me, preparing things I couldn't see. At some point my phone buzzed. Not a call. A notification. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew. Later, I found out that while I was being prepped for surgery, my parents were still unreachable. While my grandfather sat alone in a waiting room, they were making a decision of their own. And when my father finally did answer the phone, it wasn't to ask how I was. It was to say they couldn't turn back. They were already boarding the plane. I didn't hear my father's voice myself. I was already drifting by then, floating in that strange space where sounds come and go without asking permission. But later my grandfather told me exactly how it happened. He repeated the words carefully, like he was afraid they might cut twice if he rushed them. When my father finally answered the phone, he didn't sound worried. He sounded annoyed, like he'd been interrupted. My grandfather explained everything. The collapse, the scans, the tumor, the urgency. He said the doctors needed consent and that time mattered. There was a pause on the line. Then my father said, "We're about to board." Not "how is she?" Not "is she conscious?" Not even "can it wait?" Just that. My grandfather told him the surgery couldn't be delayed, that I might not make it through the night without intervention, that this wasn't a choice anymore. Another pause. Then my father said something my grandfather would never forget. "She's strong. She'll be fine." As if strength could stop pressure inside a skull. As if optimism could replace oxygen. My grandfather asked if they could turn back. My father said no. They'd already paid for the tickets. They didn't want to upset Meredith. They didn't want to ruin the trip. That was the moment the choice was made. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just calmly and without me. My grandfather ended the call himself. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just said, "I understand," even though he didn't. Then he sat there alone in the waiting room while the doctors prepared to open my head. He told me later that signing those papers felt heavier than any document he'd ever touched. Not because he doubted the decision but because he knew what it meant. It meant he was the only one choosing me. The surgery went forward without my parents' consent. Without their presence. Without their prayers or their pacing in a hospital hallway. Or their whispered promises that everything would be okay. Just fluorescent lights. Masked faces. And my grandfather sitting quietly, staring at the floor. The doctors said the procedure would take hours. They said the outcome was uncertain. They said they'd do everything they could. And then they took me away. While they were cutting, my parents were lifting their carry-on bags into the overhead bin. While machines monitored my brain, my sister was adjusting her seat by the window. While my grandfather waited for news that might break him, my parents were ordering drinks and settling in. They chose Paris. I survived the surgery. That part is important. The tumor was real. The danger was real. And the recovery was long. But the doctors did what they promised. They removed what they could. They stabilized the pressure. They gave me a chance. When I finally woke up 3 days later, my body felt like it had been rebuilt incorrectly. My head throbbed. My throat burned. My limbs felt heavy and distant, like they belonged to someone else. I opened my eyes slowly. I expected to see my parents. I expected guilt, maybe. Or relief. Or even awkward silence. Instead, I saw a ceiling. A monitor. And my grandfather asleep in a chair, his jacket still on, His hand wrapped loosely around mine. No mother. No father. No sister. Just the one person who never left. First I felt nothing. No anger. No sadness. Just a quiet numbness that settled deep in my chest. I didn't ask where they were. I already knew. But what I saw next, what waited on my phone, hurt more than the surgery. Why ever did? I didn't reach for my phone right away. My head felt heavy, like every thought had to push through water first. The room was quiet except for the steady beeping of machines I didn't recognize. My grandfather was still asleep beside me, his chin resting on his chest, his hand wrapped around mine as if he was afraid I might disappear again. When I finally picked up my phone, the screen lit up brighter than I expected. No missed calls. No voicemails. Then I opened Instagram. The first image loaded slowly, one line at a time, like it wanted to make sure I saw every detail. My parents stood in front of the Eiffel Tower, arms around each other. My sister leaned into the frame, smiling wide, sunglasses pushed into her hair. They looked relaxed, happy, untouched. The caption read, "Family trip in Paris." Finally, no stress, no drama. I stared at the words longer than the photo. No stress. No drama. 3 days earlier, doctors had cut into my skull to save my life. Tubes ran into my arms. Staples lined my scalp. And the people who raised me were celebrating a vacation like nothing had happened. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I didn't feel angry either. Just hollow. Like something important had finally finished breaking. And there was nothing left to react with. I locked my phone and set it face down on the bed. For a while nothing happened. Then the calls started. One missed call. Then another. Then 5 more. By the time I looked again, there were 65 missed calls from my dad. The timestamps were stacked so tightly they blurred together. Beneath them sat one text message, short and urgent. "We need you. Answer immediately." Not "how are you feeling?" Not "are you awake?" Not even "we're sorry." Just that. "We need you." That's when it clicked. They weren't calling because they'd realized what they'd done. They weren't calling because guilt finally caught up to them in Paris. They were calling because something had gone wrong, and they needed me to fix it. The realization settled quietly, but it stayed. I didn't answer. My grandfather woke a few minutes later and noticed the phone in my hand. He didn't ask questions. He just looked at my face, then at the screen, and nodded like he already understood. "They've been calling all morning," he said softly. I didn't answer. I thanked him. My voice came out thinner than I expected, but steady. Later that afternoon, a nurse came in to check my vitals. She asked if my parents were on their way. I told her no. She didn't push. She just smiled in that careful way people do when they realize they've stepped into something fragile. By evening, the calls slowed, then stopped. And in the silence that followed, I felt something else surface. Not pain. Not grief. Clarity. If they could leave me unconscious on an operating table and still smile for photos, then whatever they were calling family had never included me in the first place. But I still didn't know why they needed me so badly. That answer came the next morning, when my grandfather finally told me the truth about the money. My grandfather waited until the nurse left the room before he spoke. He pulled his chair closer to the bed and lowered his voice, not because anyone was listening, but because some truths deserve quiet. His hands rested on his knees. Steady. Certain. "There's a reason they're calling you like that," he said. "And it isn't concern." I didn't interrupt him. I had learned over the years that when he paused before speaking, it meant the truth was heavy. He told me about a fund I didn't know existed. My grandmother had set it up when I was born. She called it a freedom fund. Not for luxuries. Not for appearances. For security. Education. A life that didn't depend on anyone else's permission. Every birthday. Every holiday. Every milestone. She added to it quietly. The money was always meant for me. But when my grandmother's health began to fail years ago, my parents stepped in to manage things. They told everyone it was temporary, that it was easier that way, that they were protecting me from stress. Instead, they used it. My college tuition. My housing. Even the savings meant to help me after graduation. They didn't tell me because they didn't want questions. And they didn't want me to realize I'd already paid my own way twice. My grandfather looked me straight in the eyes. They assumed you wouldn't survive this, he said. Or that if you did, you'd be too grateful to question anything. The room felt smaller after that. The reason for the phone calls finally made sense. They weren't afraid for me. They were afraid of losing control of what they thought belonged to them. Because the money wasn't just money. It was leverage. If I recovered, if I became alert enough to ask questions, everything they'd taken could come to light. And once it did, there was no way to explain it away. I asked him why no one had told me sooner. He didn't rush his answer. Because they counted on you staying quiet, he said. And because I was waiting for the moment when the truth would matter. That moment was now. By the end of the day, messages started coming in from my mother. They were softer than my father's. More emotional. Words like family and misunderstandings appeared. She told me stress made people do things they didn't mean. She said we could talk when they got back. My sister sent nothing. That didn't surprise me. Late that night, my grandfather told me one more thing. Something he'd only just confirmed. My parents had already tried to access the remaining funds after my surgery. They were blocked. The account required my consent now. That was when the panic started on their end. I stared at the ceiling for a long time after he left. The machines hummed steadily around me. For the first time since the collapse, my thoughts felt clear. They hadn't abandoned me by accident. They had chosen convenience, image, comfort. And when those things were threatened, they remembered my number. The next morning, they showed up at the hospital. Smiling, concerned, ready to pretend nothing had happened. They arrived late in the morning. I knew it before I saw them. The energy in the hallway changed. Voices lowered, footsteps slowed. Like they were stepping onto a stage instead of into a hospital. My mother entered first. Her eyes were red but not swollen. Carefully emotional. My father followed, stiff and quiet, holding a coffee he hadn't touched. They stood at the foot of my bed and looked at me like I was fragile glass. "Oh, Grace," my mother said softly. "We were so worried." I didn't answer right away. I was still learning what silence could do. My father cleared his throat. "You scared us," he said, like this was something that had happened to them. They asked how I was feeling, if I needed anything, if the doctors were optimistic. All the right questions asked too late. Then my mother reached for my hand. That was when my grandfather spoke. He had been standing near the window the entire time. Calm, unmoved. When he turned around, the room felt different, like the truth had entered before he even said a word. "Sit down," he said. They did. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse them. He simply laid the facts out one by one, the way only someone with nothing to gain can. He talked about the fund, the withdrawals, the paperwork, the dates, the amounts. Numbers don't argue. They just exist. My mother stared at the floor. My father tried to interrupt. "This isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," my grandfather replied. There was a long pause after that. Then my mother spoke. "I never wanted it to be like this," she said. "But your grandmother always treated you differently. She never trusted me. She made me feel small." I watched her carefully as she spoke. She wasn't apologizing. She was explaining. My father said nothing. His silence felt heavier than any excuse. I finally spoke. "I collapsed on stage," I said quietly. "I went into surgery without my parents. Do you understand what that means?" They nodded, but I could tell they didn't, not really. "I wasn't asking for a miracle," I continued. "I was asking you to show up." My father looked up then. "We didn't think it was that serious." The room went still. "That's the problem," I said. "You never do." I told them there would be no more conversations about money, no more explanations, no more rewriting what had already happened. My grandfather had arranged everything legally. The fund was protected. My decisions were final. My mother cried then. Real tears this time. But even those didn't move me the way they once would have. Because something had shifted. I wasn't waiting for their approval anymore. I wasn't bargaining for love. I was done explaining why I deserved care. They left quietly. No shouting. No dramatic exit. Just the sound of a door closing behind them. My grandfather stayed. He squeezed my hand once and said, That's how boundaries sound when they finally settle. And for the first time since the surgery, I slept without waiting for my phone to ring. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came quietly in pieces, the way truth usually does when it's no longer being held back. I was discharged from the hospital 2 weeks later. My body was weaker, slower, still healing, but my mind felt clearer than it had in years. For the first time, I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment. My grandfather took me home with him. Not to my parents' house. Not to the place where I'd spent my childhood trying to earn space. His house was calm, predictable, safe. There was a desk by the window, a lamp that stayed on when I studied late, a chair that was always mine. It was the first time I realized how loud survival had been. My parents didn't call for a while after that. When they finally did, it wasn't to ask how I was healing. It was to talk about logistics, about what I planned to do next, about how things didn't need to be so extreme. I listened. I didn't argue. I've already made my decisions, I said. I'm focusing on recovery. They didn't like that answer. A week later, my sister's engagement quietly fell apart. No announcement. No explanation. Just the sudden absence of ring photos and countdown posts. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. When the foundation cracks, everything built on it shifts. My parents tried damage control after that. They told relatives I was confused, that I was being influenced, that surgery had changed me. In a way, they were right. It had removed something. The part of me that kept hoping they'd become different. I moved out 3 months later, using the money that was rightfully mine. Not extravagantly, just enough to stand on my own. A small place near campus. Quiet. Clean. Mine. I paid off my student loans in full. The relief was physical. Like letting go of a weight I'd been carrying so long. I'd forgotten it wasn't normal. My parents didn't congratulate me. They sent a message instead. Short. Careful. We need to talk about how this looks. I never replied. My grandfather updated his will shortly after that. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't explain himself. He simply told me one afternoon over tea that clarity changes priorities. I'm proud of you, he said. Not for what you endured, but for what you stopped tolerating. That stayed with me. Healing wasn't dramatic after that. It was quiet. Therapy sessions, follow-up scans, long walks, learning how to rest without guilt. I started teaching the next year. Standing in front of a classroom felt different after everything. I didn't take presence for granted anymore. I noticed who showed up, who listened, who needed encouragement without being asked. I became the adult I wish I'd had. My parents tried once more about a year later. An email this time. Longer. Softer. Apologetic in tone, but vague in responsibility. They wanted to start fresh. To move forward. I read it carefully. Then I archived it. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. Because moving forward doesn't mean going back to places that taught you to disappear. 2 years after the surgery, my grandfather was honored publicly for his work in the community. I sat in the front row as he accepted the award. When he mentioned family, he looked at me. That was enough. I didn't need a grand reunion. I didn't need public apologies. I didn't need to win. I needed peace. And I found it not by being chosen but by choosing myself. 2 years later, my life looks ordinary. And that's how I know I survived. I wake up early now not because I'm anxious but because I like the quiet. I make coffee the same way every morning. I review lesson plans at the kitchen table. I leave the house knowing where I'm going and why. I teach full-time. Standing in front of a classroom still humbles me. Not because of authority but because presence matters. I see it in the students who linger after class. In the ones who work 2 jobs. In the ones who smile too much because they don't want to be a problem. I recognize them. I never ask for their whole story. I don't need to. I know what it looks like to carry weight quietly. My health stabilized. The follow-up scans came back clean. The doctors used words like fortunate and early intervention. I nodded and thanked them, but I knew the truth was simpler. Someone showed up. My grandfather slowed down a lot after that year. He stopped driving at night. He forgot small things. But he never forgot to ask how my day went. We had dinner together every Sunday. Sometimes we talked about school. sometimes about nothing at all. And sometimes, when the room felt heavy in the right way, he'd say things like, "People confuse love with obligation." He was right. Love is choice. My parents and I don't speak anymore. Not because I hate them. Not because I'm waiting for an apology. But because silence finally feels honest. They tried once more last winter. A holiday card. Neutral words. No accountability. Just enough sentiment to reopen a door they never learned how to respect. I didn't throw it away. I placed it in a drawer and closed it gently. That was the boundary. My sister moved on with her life separately from mine. We're polite when paths cross. Nothing more. Nothing less. I don't carry bitterness about that anymore. Not everyone is meant to walk with you through every season. Some people are lessons. My grandfather passed away peacefully this spring. At the memorial, people stood up one by one and talked about his integrity, his consistency, his quiet generosity. I listened and realized something important. He didn't rescue me. He reminded me who I was when everyone else benefited from me forgetting. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't talk about inheritance, or conflict, or pain. I said, "He taught me that love isn't loud. It shows up. It stays. And it doesn't ask you to disappear to deserve it." That's what stayed with people. After everything, I don't think about my family the way I used to. I don't ask what I did wrong. I don't wonder what I could have been. I understand now that worth doesn't come from being chosen by people who only love when it's convenient. It comes from boundaries. Comes from clarity. It comes from learning that you can be kind, calm, and still walk away. If there's one thing this experience changed inside me, it's this. I stopped negotiating my right to exist fully. If you're listening to this and you've ever been the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who carried everything without being seen, this isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of your separation from what was never yours to fix. Love is who shows up. Love is who stays. And love never asks you to collapse to earn a place. If this story resonated with you, tell me, what boundary changed your life the most?